Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pension Review Board's Pension Basics Legislative Seminar, and thank you for joining us today. Please note that we are recording and live streaming this seminar, and the only housekeeping announcement we have for you is please feel free to ask questions, and you can either chat us or raise hand. Use that icon and we will know that you have a question. You can either unmute yourself or Ashley, are we unmuting them so they can ask a question, or just chat your question to us? Either way is fine, whatever you feel comfortable with. So we have three great staff speakers lined up for you today. I will very briefly talk about who we are, what we do, and then turn the mic over to Michelle Cranes. She's the Deputy Director, and she will provide an overview of the landscape and governance of Texas pension plans, as well as discuss the two new statutory mandates that the agency has been busy monitoring from last session. Kenny Herbold is the Chief Actuary, and he will go over the basics of pension plan financing, including discussing briefly the key measures to evaluate pension plan health here in Texas, and he'll tie everything together for you by discussing the Texas trends data relative to those areas. And finally, Ashley Rendon, she's the Director of Policy and Communications, will discuss the actuarial impact statement process that the agency follows during legislative sessions when the legislature is working on any pension bills, and finish up by telling you a little bit about the data center that we have most recently augmented and is available for you all to access for most current pension data. So jumping right into our presentation, the Pension Review Board, and you may have heard me talk about this a little bit, the primary duties that we are charged with, of course, is relative to the public pension plans that we oversee, to conduct a continuing review of those systems based on the information that we collect from the plans. We also perform intensive reviews to identify or highlight any potential or existing problems the systems may face. We offer educational training through our minimum educational training program to the retirement system trustees and administrators. Of course, we'll be talking about the actuarial impact statement process, and then on an ongoing basis, we do provide technical assistance to our retirement systems if we receive questions either regarding PRBs, policies and procedures, or the reports that they have to send to us, or on an ongoing basis, generally speaking, the best practices that the Pension Review Board discusses or recommends to a retirement system. So on a very high level, we do provide technical assistance, as well as it's relative to specific pension systems as well, based on the requests that we receive from our systems. And as our speakers are going to talk about the different areas, you'll see how some of these primary duties are tied to the different aspects that they're going to discuss with you. Next slide, please. The agency itself is very small. Currently, we have a staff of 11. We do have a board of 7 members appointed by the governor, who are experts in areas related to public pensions. We are required to hold at least three board meetings every year, and we broadcast those to our systems as well. And then I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to discuss the landscape of Texas pension plans.
Thank you, Anu. Hello, and I'm Michelle Downey Cranes, Deputy Director. Hello, and thank you for coming to all the legislative staff and members of the systems themselves, some of whom are here. Look forward to meeting the legislative staff and PIFs committee staff, but for today we'll do some talking at you, hopefully not too much. And Ashley, if you'll please break in if we get questions in the chat and let me know. Thank you. So we're going to spend 2 slides here on the landscape of Texas plans to try to give you some background and context for understanding public retirement systems in Texas. There's 2 ways that we usually think about the landscape, by plan type, which is this slide 4 here, and by governing statute, which is what we'll cover next. So there are 347 total public retirement systems in Texas, but to break that down, there's 100 actuarially funded defined benefit plans, and those are the plans that the state, I would say generally through us, the PRB, focuses on because they promise specific benefits to retirees. And of course, that means that there's risk involved for the employer, both in the need to deliver those promised benefits and investing the funds in a trust. The remainder of plans are defined contribution, which are generally supplemental plans, such as the Texas Saver that you all have access to with ERS, or very small volunteer firefighter pensions that have quite a small benefit, and those are paid as they come due generally from the city's budget. So of the 100 defined benefit plans, we have 2 hybrid. They're specifically cash balance plans in Texas, which are very unique and often looked at as models nationwide. Those are what you might call umbrella plans. They're voluntary for cities in the case of Texas Municipal Retirement System, and counties and districts in the case of Texas County and District Retirement System. Voluntary for those entities to join. Of course, you'll see from the numbers here, most cities in Texas, cities and towns are in TMRS, and most counties and districts, vast majority, are in TCDRS. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of the major municipal systems that have their own retirement plans. But again, most cities and towns are in TMRS, and they even have San Antonio Municipal Retirement System, which I think is still their largest. The last bullet talks again about those defined contribution plans, which are primarily supplemental, and as I've mentioned, and they're generally offered by school districts, river and transport authorities, housing, et cetera, and they can take a variety of forms. Then on the next slide, we'll look at this, drill down on those 100 actuarially funded defined benefit plans. And here we usually put them into 4 major buckets. 7 of those we call statewide retirement systems. 7 may seem like a high number, but that's because we are breaking out for employees' retirement system multiple plans that they administer. So ERS main fund, judicial retirement system, and then LECOS, which is a supplemental benefit for certain public safety and custodial officers. Then the 2 cash balance hybrids we talked about, TCDRS and TMRS, teacher retirement system, and TESRS, which is a statewide plan for volunteer firefighters, which again, districts or an emergency service personnel, that those entities can choose to join. Moving to the major municipal retirement systems, there are 17 of those. So here you start to disperse into a patchwork of governing statutes. So these are all in Vernon's civil statutes in a number of chapters, and we have those detailed in a chart in the appendix. But essentially there are 14 systems enabled by state statute in those Vernons, and then 3 that are actually not in state statute were created by city ordinance, which include Dallas employees, Galveston employees, and El Paso City employees. There are then 42 paid and part paid firefighter systems that are created under one single act called the Texas Local Firefighters Retirement Act. We call it TELFRA. If you hear that acronym, I'm sorry for lots of acronyms, but those plans all have the same governing structure, the same, for example, board, ways that they can change contributions and benefits, and they're located in that specific chapter or article of Vernon's listed right there. And finally, there are 34 systems that are offered by, again, generally districts, but remember, these are defined benefit plans offered by water districts and special districts of all different kinds that we do monitor carefully because they have promised benefits. And they're organized under a very general chapter of Texas Government Code, which is 810. We can tell you more about those if you're interested, but they have a lot of leeway locally for the sponsor to arrange their systems the way they'd like. So the next slide looks at the Constitution. All of the state and local systems I've just described are enabled by the Constitution, which also provides that their financing be based on sound actuarial principles. And there are 2 points here I'd like to make sure you're aware of. So the third bullet talks about TRS and ERS. They have a very specific provision which places a floor and ceiling 6% and 10% on the state contributions to those funds. Second is the constitutional benefit protection, which was put in place back in, I think, the early 2000s, which prohibits the reduction of benefits that are accrued. And you can see here 8 cities opted out of that, but it has been tested in the courts, and generally courts have determined that prospective benefit changes, meaning for future service, do not violate that provision. So you're mostly talking about benefits already accrued at that point that are protected. Moving on, again, we use the word patchwork on slide 7. You'll see, I think, some more examples of how it's there are a lot of different provisions that govern how systems can make changes. So generally speaking, decision-making authority, we're most interested in how contributions and benefits can be changed. They vary across systems. So looking first at ERS and TRS, those boards do not set contribution or benefit policy themselves. Those are set in statute and can only be changed by the legislature. Some municipal retirement systems, some of those 17 that we talked about, have to come before the legislature to make changes to those items. We put in parentheses here San Antonio Fire and Police just as one example of a fund that would have to have a bill to make changes to those key drivers. And there are more. I think Austin Fire is one, but possibly police, and we can get you those if you need it. Then there are other municipal systems, as well as all of those 42 firefighter systems under TELFRA, that are allowed to make certain benefit and contribution changes without legislative approval. So that's, for example, Houston Municipal, Fort Worth Employees, Dallas Police and Fire, and then again, all the firefighter funds. And so they have a lot more flexibility to make benefit and contribution changes at the local level. Finally, again, I think I pretty much already covered this. The systems organized under 810, those special districts pretty much have complete authority to determine their provisions locally. That is where I turn it over to Kenny, unless there are questions on that first section.
Not seeing any questions, so I'll jump in. So I'm going to talk more about the math side of stuff, and it's really easy to get lost in the weeds with all of this. So I'm going to do my best to keep it really high level. I do have a tendency to get into too many details, so I apologize if I do that. I also have a tendency to talk really fast, so I'll try and slow down from what I typically do. So just really a basic pension financing equation is all about money in on one side versus money going out on the other side. And obviously, those two things have to be equal. Contributions and investment income are really the only ways that money comes into the plan. And then benefits is the primary purpose of these trusts. And so that's where the majority of the expenses are going to fall. So I think one of the things that is probably worth pointing out for defined benefit plans, right? The benefit, as the name suggests, is defined. Maybe it's an equation It depends on the plan itself. But the real cost of those plans are the benefits that are going to be paid out at the end. So my job and other actuaries' jobs, right, are to estimate what that's going to look like over a really long period of time, and then figure out what's a reasonable amount of contributions to put in based on how much money we think the trust is going to make, right? So in general, the plan, actuaries are estimating the amount of contributions that need to go into the plan, but we're also, having to estimate all of the other things associated with that in order to get it. So it's we don't really know until the very end what the ultimate cost of the plan is going to be. For a defined contribution, on the other hand, the benefits that come out, that's all dependent on how the investments do. But as far as the cost to the employer, really the only cost is what the contributions are and what the employer or the employees themselves put into the plan. Everything as far as investment risk, all that lies with the employees on a defined contribution plan. So a hybrid plan is kind of a mix of the two. It looks a lot like a DC plan. It's designed to make it easier to understand, make it a little bit easier to see the value of your benefit right now. But really the funding looks a lot more like a defined benefit plan. So that risk is placed a little bit more on the plan sponsor or on the trust itself, or shared between the employees and the plan sponsor. And we go to the next slide. So there's, in general, two ways we kind of look at how we are doing on that equation. The funded ratio is really, it's the ratio of assets to liabilities. So if I owe you $100 and I have $80 in my pocket, I'm 80% funded. I got to get $20 from somewhere in order to give you the $100 that I owe you. That's all it is. It doesn't tell us really how we got here, and it doesn't tell us how we're going to get that extra $20. It just tells us where we are right now as far as what we owe other people. For amortization period, this one is a little bit more, I'll say, functional. It's really kind of forward-looking, because it's basically trying to calculate how long, if we don't have, it's really trying to calculate how long is it going to take me to get that $20 in order to have all of the money I need in order to pay you. So basically what we're looking at is we have some sort of unfunded piece of benefits that we've already promised. And the question is, how long is it going to take us to fully fund that benefit, right? Or fully fund that debt? It's got a lot like if you go out and get a mortgage, you get a 30-year mortgage and you pay the exact payment, it's going to take you 30 years to pay off that debt. However, if you throw in an extra $100 or $200 every month, you know you're going to pay it off a little bit faster. And so you can calculate, okay, it's not at 30 years. Maybe now it's going to take me 23 years or 24 years. And that's really what an amortization period is doing. It's looking at how much you owe somebody, what your unfunded piece is, and how much the contributions are that are going in, and figuring out how long it's going to take to get to a place where the plan is fully funded. And again, it's a little bit forward-looking. Obviously, that those amortization periods when we talk about those, they do depend on the assumptions being met. So gains and losses will certainly have an impact on that as well. We'll go on to the next one. All right, so this kind of gives us a good overall view of where Texas in total has been going, or where, how it has changed over the past decade. So this is all assets and liabilities for all Texas plans. So TRS by itself, I think they're at $160 billion in assets. So they really make up nearly 50% of this. If you add in all of the statewide, I think we're talking 75 to 85% of the assets and liabilities here belong to the statewide. And then all of the other plans, so the other 93 plans kind of make up the rest of that 25%. So it really kind of shows you how much of an impact when you're looking at Texas in the aggregate, TRS and the statewide have on this particular graph. And as you'll notice, unfunded accrued liability has clearly been growing over time. There's a number of reasons why that can happen. That certainly can happen if you don't hit your assumptions. but it's not unexpected if contributions aren't large enough, right? So if you're looking at where ERS is currently standing, they did not get their actuarially sound contribution for an extended period of time. And when something like that happens, you know the unfunded as a dollar amount is going to grow. We also see the funded ratio going down, so that's going to be impacted as well by the liabilities growing faster than the assets. And there's a couple of blips in here. If you look at 2017 or 2018, there's a pretty big drop. One of the other big things, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, is the assumed investment return has a pretty big impact on these numbers as well. And so if we go back to the equation that I mentioned earlier, all of your income either comes from contributions or it comes from investment income. So if your assumed investment income goes down, the right side, the benefits and the expenses aren't changing. That means your expected contributions have to go up. So that's kind of the relationship that happens there. We'll move on to the next one. Okay, so the Pension Review Board itself has put out funding guidelines. These are not state law. These are simply recommendations that our board has put together. Kind of the thing that you should focus on here is the bolded part in item number 4. Basically, this talks about amortization period, and what the board has said is the maximum. So we don't think that any amortization period should be above 30 years. Preferred range is going to be 10 to 25 years. And then the very last piece at the end of that sentence where it says exceeds 25 years, that's talking about where the amortization should fall after a benefit enhancement is incorporated. So this differs from the statutory requirements for ERS and TRS. There are statutory requirements that say a new benefit enhancement like a COLA for retirees for ERS or TRS cannot be passed if the amortization period is greater than 31 years after the bill is passed. So this is slightly different than what's currently in statute for ERS and TRS. But again, this doesn't have the force of state law. This is simply recommendations that the board has put out. And this was originally, most recently published and updated back in 2017. So funding soundness restoration plan is in state law. This is one of the few pieces that kind of talks about or requires plans, non-statewide plans, to do something about where their funded level or their actual benefits sit. So if one of these plans, Muni Plan and 810, has an amortization period that is greater than 40 for multiple valuations, so it's basically 3 years in a row, they're required to get together with their governing body, so with their plan sponsor, so whatever city they're in, and come up with a plan to essentially get to an amortization period of 50. That gets you 40 years within 10 years. If once they come up with that plan, they have to continue to update us for every couple of years to make sure that they're actually continuing to move down, and they're ultimately going to hit an amortization period of 40 within a specified period of time. If their amortization period doesn't continue down that slide, and at some point it looks like they're not going to be able to hit that 40-year AM period by that deadline, they have to come back to the table, create a revised FSRP to then come up with a new plan to fix since the original plan wasn't sufficient. I think we can go on. The next slide has a number of stats about what's happened since 2015. So I want to be clear that this law went into effect in September 2015, and the first plans were not due to the PRB until the end of 2016. So really what we're talking about is 4.5 years since this has really been, since we've seen plans and systems coming to the table and making these plans specific to these requirements. So during that period of time, we've had 19 of the 100 plans become subject to this requirement. 17 of those have submitted some form of an FSRP, so their first FSRP. Unfortunately, 11 of that 17 essentially had to come back to the table because their original plan wasn't sufficient to get them to where they needed to be. And the number of causes, it could be, they made changes that put them just right on the edge of getting there, as long as everything happened the way they assumed, and then maybe they had some asset losses or something else happened to kind of push them off as they were going. But generally, that was most likely to occur if plans didn't make large enough changes to really get down well below that 50-year mark, and kind of were relatively close to that mark on their first plan. Thankfully, 9 out of the 17 plans have actually gotten themselves below 40 and are no longer subject to this requirement. Unfortunately, the very last stat says 2 of those 9 plans are now back above 40 and are potentially going to have to come back to the table after a couple of more valuations. And then one of the other things I wanted to point out on these stats, there's 5 plans that have not submitted the most recent either initial or revised FSRP that is currently due. So we have plans, there is no, I guess the point is that there's not a lot of, while there are requirements and there's a timeline, the plans have basically 6 months to come up with something to fix their plan and get them back to the point that they need to be. And there are some potential difficulties with that timeline. And then there's no, well, I guess one of the questions that generally pops up is there's nothing that we can do. Our role is oversight, not regulatory. So our role is to say, to let you guys know that this has occurred, right? That there was a deadline and that's passed at this point. And so our role is to let you know there's not, other than having a conversation with these plans, which we have, we've talked to the majority of them, and we have additional information that we can provide about the status of these FSRPs. But there's nothing that we can do to say that must occur or penalize them in any way when it doesn't. I think we can move on to 14. So slide 14 is just a quick overview of one of the things that we do. So Anu mentioned that one of our roles is to perform intensive reviews of plans. So during 2017 through 2019, we completed, I think that's 9, or is it, no, yes, it's 9. We completed 9 intensive reviews. We found a number of very similar things, and made a number of very similar recommendations. I'm not going to read all those to you; those are obviously there. And so we've been told that these reviews have provided a lot of help. But again, it's our opportunity to take a slightly more deep dive into the plan, do a little bit of analysis, try and bring the plan and the plan sponsor to a board meeting or a committee meeting to have a conversation about how the plan got to where it is. And it's our way of trying to identify potential red flags in advance of any problems getting too far out of hand. And I will note that a couple plans on this list, Galveston Police in particular, ultimately came to the legislature to make changes that were, took into account a number of the recommendations that we made during our intensive reviews. We can move on. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, I was going to come back to the impact of assumed rates of return. So the reason we talk about this so much, one is because it is an assumption that impacts how we calculate the present value. And so it's how we report the liability for each of these plans. And so this is probably the one assumption that has the biggest impact when you change it up or down on the number that we report as the plan liability, and then therefore the number that is considered unfunded. And then it's also extremely important because it helps inform what we think the contributions need to be. So as I said earlier, if we assume, the assumption comes down, that means we are assuming we're going to get less money from our investments. Well, the costs aren't changing, so now we have to get more money from contributions. And it's just a very simple relationship, and that's kind of the reason why the number gets bigger, because it's really kind of a measure of, okay, what do we need to do as far as contributions today in order to get to our number, or to our fully funded number. And you can see that the Texas average for assumed rates of return is pretty close to the national average. And both ERS and TRS have lowered their return in the recent past. ERS took a two-step approach from 2018 and then in 2020, and they're probably likely to look at that again in the next 2 to 4 years. TRS went down from 8 to 7.25 in 2018, and I believe they're scheduled to look at it again in 2022. So it's fairly common for plans to review that number every 4 or 5 years, because this is intended to be a long-term assumption, and obviously, given it has the largest impact on the liabilities, you don't want it to change too frequently. So it's one that we try and hold steady for as long as possible. You can go on, and that might be my last slide. Nope, I have a number of graphs that I forgot about. So we have a couple of graphs. I'm not really going to talk about them for the most part. They provide some review of what's been happening with our assumptions. So this one is the most 2 recent AVs. It kind of gives you an average of where the plans stand. I can go on, Ashley. This next slide, I think, is showing actual returns over a certain number of periods, comparing it to the red, which is the current assumed rate of return. These are averages, and it's important to recognize, I don't know if looks like that footnote's not in there. There's a wide variety of fiscal year ends in here. And so that's one of the biggest reasons when you look at short-term returns, there's a wide discrepancy, right? In these averages, statewide plans in particular, the majority of them have a fiscal year end in August versus I think we counted something like 60+% of or more of our plans have a calendar year fiscal year end. And so short-term returns, that they're going to vary pretty wildly, and when the fiscal year end certainly has an impact. And so that's one of the reasons why we focus a little bit more on long-term trends, long-term returns when we're comparing those against the assumed rate of return and discount rate. This is just a quick slide to give you a general idea of how asset allocations have changed over the past 10 years. I think we can move on to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so last piece of information that people probably care about is COVID-19 and what happened. So generally speaking, investment returns came back. So plans were not really impacted quite as much by equity returns, but there are still some unknowns about what's going to happen, because it's not just about equity returns. So near term, it's really budgetary constraints and not being in the plan sponsors not being able to make increased contributions when they need to now. And then long term, we're not really sure what's going to happen. We obviously have continued low interest rates, and so we're not sure what that means for expected investment returns, contribution levels, and where that goes for payroll growth and those types of things. I think that's everything. And as I said, there's a lot of details that can be talked about, so we're happy to answer additional questions.
Okay, that's everything for Kenny's section. I'm back. There's a bit left, and I want to make sure we get to actuarial impact statements. So, and keep mindful of time. So I'm going to go, not going to spend as much time as I might. However, we've been busy in the last interim helping to implement and then monitor 2 major pieces of legislation from last session. The first was SB 2224, which required all retirement systems to adopt a written funding policy that targets 100% funding. We did a number of things to try to help that along. By the way, that's a best practice among retirement systems, particularly those that receive a fixed rate of contribution based on pay rather than the actuarially determined contribution. So the idea is to make sure they have a plan in place to get to 100% funding. We worked with systems over many meetings, developed guidance. We were also asked to provide a sample funding policy, and we encouraged systems. Our board really spoke a lot about encouraging systems to work with their sponsors, because of course there are two parties to the careful balance of how a pension fund is maintained, and that is not only the fund if it has its own board, but the sponsoring entity that's paying contributions into it. So both should be ideally involved in the development of a funding policy. So we've received 96 of the 100 funding policies. Those that we still don't have are from Colorado River Municipal Water District, Midland Fire, Northeast Medical Center Hospital Plan, and University Park Fire. In general, the funding policies were very good. They almost all used PRB recommended practices, such as benchmarking their fixed rate contributions against an actuarially determined rate. Two areas generally our board found concerning. One was the lack of apparent development with the sponsor. We only saw a handful that clearly showed that both entities had been involved in cases where that's available. There are some plans where the sponsor is the plan and there's no separate board, and others where you're talking about working with the legislature. And so, caveats here, but in general, the other concern was plans using benchmarks that would never really reach 100% funding. We call them rolling benchmarks rather than closed. And then finally, there was some risk sharing elements, and such as automatic triggers for benefit and contribution changes if funding status is not where it needs to be. But we'd like to see more of those in future funding policies. The next bill that we monitored was Senate Bill 322, which related to, it really enhanced the state's oversight of pension investments and through the PRB. It had two parts. So the first part were new investment expense disclosures in annual financial reports. We actually published rules to help systems with that, again, created a template, and we'll be seeing the first disclosures. They're due next month, and reporting those to the board and the ledge. I think, this will really lead to some enhanced transparency in some of those more typically opaque alternative investments. Second piece was an investment practices and performance evaluation. So systems above a certain asset level had to select an independent firm to evaluate their investment practices and performance and provide recommendations to the system. We've received all but 3 of those, which are Corpus Christi Transit Authority, Midland Fire, and Nacogdoches County Hospital. I think if there was one overarching theme to those evaluations, it was really the need for systems to formally review and benchmark their investment fees. There was a lot of discussion about fees and expenses. And our investment committee also had some legislative recommendations to tighten up that legislation, which are now in the form of a filed bill. It's Senate Bill 1372 by Senator Huffman. And we're going to move to a slide that discusses some of the recommendations, thank you, Ashley, that were made by my board. So the first the first two, let's go to the third bullet, investment performance report, and first talk about the recommendations that flowed from our review of the investment practice and performance evaluations that I just talked about. So one thing I failed to mention on those, we as PRB developed a report after analyzing all of those, and it's linked in this presentation. And we also provided a summary of each evaluation. So if you're interested in any particular system, hopefully that'll give you a shorter, say 2-page summary of what was in it, if you don't have a chance to read the whole thing. The legislative recommendations from our board on this include amending statute to require the evaluations to detail how the evaluator determined the need or lack thereof for any recommendations. So as background, this stemmed from We saw a decent number of evaluations that didn't make any recommendations, which is actually a requirement of the statute, and also didn't have much verbiage explaining why things were okay and weren't in need of improvement. And of course, that's sometimes true that things are going just fine, and the investment consultant, if that's who's conducting the evaluation, for example, doesn't see need for improvement. But this would, we think, enhance those evaluations in the future by making sure that they are more explicit as to whether recommendations were, considered and needed or not. Then second, it would add a formal review and comment process prior to publication. So this was stemming from our board was not always totally clear on whether the system itself had a chance and say at the governing board level to review the evaluation very carefully and consider implementing any recommendations made. So this would add in a formal process for that. The third bullet on feasibility of whether an independent firm that is not the investment consultant who helped develop investment policies, that provision is not in the filed bill. But finally, there are disclosures regarding potential conflicts of interest. Now, jumping back up to the first two bullets, you will also see House Bill 3898 biannual, which has been filed. And this stems from recommendations made by the Pension Review Board relating to both the funding policy statute that we discussed a minute ago and the FSRPs that Kenny covered. So the first recommendation I'd mentioned, sponsor involvement seemed to be pretty low, adds the sponsor to the funding policy requirements so that it needs to be developed in collaboration with the sponsor when possible. And that's true of the FSRP, so it would cause those to mirror each other. Second, the changes for the FSRP that are in the bill. So our board went through a long process of working with stakeholders and putting these things out for comment. And what was, passed on to the legislature and filed in the bill have some pretty major changes to a law that went into place back in I think 2015, and needs some updating. So the first ties the ties the funding policy and FSRP together. So what that means is if a plan is required to do an FSRP, they then have to go back with their sponsor and also improve their funding policy to make sure they don't continue to be underfunded and require additional FSRPs. Second, probably the biggest change is bringing the threshold for becoming subject to the FSRP in line with PRB guidelines and actuarial standards of today, which means that it changes a 40-year amortization period trigger to 30 years. And as you know, that's the upper bound of PRB guidelines. It then changes the trigger to create sort of a tiered trigger. So not everyone who's over 30 years would immediately become subject. Those that had an amortization period over 30 and a funded ratio lower than 65% would become immediately subject. And those whose funded ratio was above 65% would still have multiple valuation triggers like exists today. I know this is a lot of technical and dense information. Please feel free to ask us questions after. Some other changes that are rather large are it allows 2 years instead of 6 months because plans and their sponsors really didn't feel like they had enough time to go through all the channels and iterations that they needed. So it extends how long folks have to create it, but then shortens the time frame. Instead of 10 years, they need to get to a 30-year amortization period within 2 years of the trigger. Then to address, Kenny talked about the systems that have become subject to revised FSRPs, and we have some that are now subject to a second revised. That can become sort of a repeating cycle, and to try to eliminate that, this bill would put in stricter requirements. So if you become subject to a second FSRP within a period of 10 years, then you would have to include stricter requirements for funding restoration, like actuarially determined contributions or risk sharing mechanisms like we talked about before. I think that's where I'm going to leave it. And Ashley, are you up next? Yes.
Yes. Thanks, Michelle. And so the biggest thing that we do during session is to provide actuarial impact statements to the legislature for bills that would have some kind of impact. And we analyze the economic or financial impact of a proposed pension bill on a retirement system. And by doing this, right, we're providing the legislature with information that assists in managing pension costs. And we have some kind of statistics from last session on our bill tracking. We do this every session. We track all the pension bills that are filed. And with the filing deadline last week, we have around 80 pension bills that we're following this session. And hearings have started, and so we are working to, we have started doing the impact statements already, and so that is kind of in full swing for us. So we'll see how many, if we can top that 43. I'm just kidding. Okay, and so how do we know when we need to do an impact statement? That is based on that basic funding equation that Kenny talked about, and that you'll probably hear from other systems talking about, which is that contributions plus income equals benefits plus expenses. Essentially, if a pension bill is filed and has an effect on these things, it would trigger an impact statement. And so we've provided some examples for you on this page, and really wanted to kind of give a little more. So for contributions, an increase or decrease in employee or non-employer contributions, if you remember from last session, Senate Bill 12 affected TRS and raised contributions for the state, for certain employers, and for employees incrementally for several years. And so that had a big impact on TRS. And so we had an impact statement for that. And then really the biggest other part of this equation that gets affected in these bills is benefits, changes to benefits. And so I wanted to give a little bit more explanation. So if we're talking about changing and adding a tier, it would be, for example, you see a bill that says for new employees as of this date, and then it has different benefits than what was currently in statute. So that would indicate a new tier. And then also benefit formula, if it is changed a multiplier or final average salary, you'll see something that says, highest 36 months or based on the highest 60 months. Those kinds of changes would indicate a change to the benefit formula. And then, of course, anything concerning an adjustment to benefits, such as a cost of living adjustment or an additional or supplemental payment. And so how it all works is that when a bill with a potential cost effect is scheduled for a committee hearing, we reach out to a system that is being affected by the bill, and they provide us with an actuarial analysis on the bill. And so once we receive that, it's reviewed by our staff actuary, and so he provides the actuarial review, which could be seen as a second opinion of that actuarial analysis. And so those two documents together, plus of course a summary of the bill, are summarized into the actuarial impact statement. And that's prepared by our staff and submitted to the LBB. And then the LBB publishes the final statement, actuarial impact statement, and that is attached to the bill in the committee and stays with the bill. And so I like to think of it as physically, if we had the bill printed out, we would staple the impact statement to that, and it goes along with the process until the bill is changed. So if the bill is changed, we go through the process all over again. And then it stays with the bill again until it's unless it's changed. Also, this last point here on this page, we do what is called a cumulative effect of all pension bills affecting, and this is just for TRS and ERS. And so each impact statement is only for that particular bill. And so we analyze the effect of just that bill. For TRS and ERS, we do a cumulative effect. And so it's kind of a larger impact statement, and it's dependent on whether the bill has been heard for the 70 days, whether it's been heard in a committee, or for the 30-day, it's whether it's been passed by at least one house. And so that's what I have on the impact statement process. I wanted to go over the resources, the additional resources that we have provided as well, which are you would find hopefully helpful during session and beyond. And so we have a public pension data center, and that takes the information that we receive from the plans and provides, the charts and graphs that we, have here in a little bit more of analysis. I'll show you some in the appendix. We have extra, we have some screenshots of it. And so, and of course, once this presentation, once we're done today, we'll make this available, and all of these links are clickable. So you should be able to access this information here. But it allows you to see by plan the information that we've received from the plan, and then comparative by different types or by asset size. You can compare the plans information, and then also an aggregate of all the pension systems in Texas. And then we have the PRB Guide to Public Retirement Systems in Texas. That guide we publish before or during on legislative session years. And that essentially used to be where we had lots and lots of information. Luckily, we were able to get that into our data center. And so we would say that this guide is a good primer or a supplement to the data center. And then, of course, we have our online courses that if you are so inclined and you are so excited to look more into pension information, you can find our online courses, which are available to everyone free, and are on these 7 topic areas. And you can go through at your leisure. And so again, the data center here is included in this appendix, and we'll make this information available to you all. Send you the link to this presentation, and then also we'll have it on our website, and of course the YouTube will be available on our this video will be available on our YouTube page. And so with that, I will open it up for questions. If you have anything, we will be happy to answer.
Thank you, Ashley. Looks like folks are good. We're here. Please reach out if it pops into your head later, or you have a question about a bill. We'd love to help.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Will these slides be available
via email after the meeting?
Yes, so we will send, for everybody who has attended today, we will follow up with this presentation as well as a link to the YouTube just in case.
Thank you.
I have a question. With regard to SB 1372 and the conflict of interest provisions that have been identified, I do know presentations have been made before various different plans, either in a broad situation at conferences and so forth, or individually for outsourced CIO services to be provided by investment consultants or formerly investment consultants that would become outsourced CIOs. How do the provisions of 1372 sit with that in terms of conflicts of interest with regard to selection of managers, asset allocation, fiduciary responsibility, pricing of services, selection of managers, and asset allocations?
Great question, Bob. Will you let us go over it and get back to you?
Certainly.
Okay. We will. And I don't mean to dismiss your question, but I'd not necessarily thought through those disclosures from the exact angle and lens that you're asking. So I want to do justice to it.
Yeah, no problem at all, Michelle. I have one other question I'd pose in terms of the various different testing and meeting kind of minimum standards and requirements. One of the things that I'm not quite clear on in terms of requirements is particularly when you have negatively amortizing plans on a cash flow basis, is there any provision that requires cash flow testing or scenario analysis or something along those lines to exhibit what the cash flow amortization looks like under various different conditions on a go-forward basis?
Hi, Bob, and I may have missed part of your question. Are you asking with regards to a specific bill that has been filed, or?
Yes, in terms of standards of practice, I know that we're talking about balance sheets, basically, assets versus liabilities. But I'm interested to say, within the statutes or under the requirements of the PRB, what kind of cash flow, funding analysis is there required at the moment or intended on, in the future?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. As our statute stands today, or as Chapter 802 that includes the reporting requirements for our system stands today, there aren't any specific disclosure requirements with regards to cash flow analysis necessarily. Of course, systems, as they perform their actuarial valuations, or some of the bigger plans that conduct asset liability studies, do those type of more engaged analysis. And from a best practice standpoint, those are some of the things we have talked about through our intensive reviews, through some of the board discussions and best practices that the board has discussed. So those are some of the practices, stress testing, scenario analysis that we certainly talk about. And as I understand, the actuarial community is talking about as well. And we encourage our systems to try to incorporate those type of reviews or evaluations as part of either their asset liability analysis, or as some of the systems, I know some of the bigger plans do some type of limited stress testing as part of their actuarial valuation process. But as far as making it a requirement in Chapter 802, we haven't seen any bills filed so far, and I believe the bill filing deadline, of course, was last Friday. But from a best practice standpoint, the board has talked about incorporating those, encouraged the systems to include those type of analysis and consider those on a moving forward basis.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Good. Again, please feel free to email us any additional questions you may have later or at any point, or if you would like us to take a deeper dive into any of the topics that were discussed today, we'd be happy to do that. All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.